Today we have a couple of pieces that we're going to try to navigate through in thinking about how we can bridge between what academics like myself do as well as how we partner and work synergistically with libraries. I will confess, I also have a library degree. Libraries have an important part of my sort of research involves library research, information retrieval, and the like, so I do have a slightly biased, in this case, very favorable view of libraries. For today, we will start with Andrew going through some of the challenges that we see in adapting digital repositories of one type or another. And then Hope will then shift into how institutional repositories can be used for navigating and managing publications. And then eventually we'll sort of talk together about how that melds into partnerships between informatics groups like mine, which serves as one of the gateways to our, at least the biomedical faculty at our institution. So overall, the goal of this session is to, as it's stated, to understand the challenges of developing an evolving library repository. So as we all know, I don't need to belabor the point, we all build these beautiful infrastructures. And we perennially run into this challenge of we build it and they will come. And then we try to explain to an academic, well, this is why we built it this way, because it's really nice and you have to know what metadata is. And it's increased, as the world's becoming more digital, faculty as a whole are becoming a little more and more increasing, and I'm going to get myself in trouble by saying this, but we're becoming more and more know-it-alls, right? We all think, well, how hard is this library stuff? We can do it. And that's actually what led me down the path to get a library degree, in fact, is I said, well, how hard can this stuff actually be? I went to library school and said, well, it's actually really hard. There's a lot that goes on here. And actually to have that appreciation is actually unusual. And so one of my roles actually at our institution, Brown, which is a relatively small institution actually, we have very intimate relationships between faculty, our technical staff, and our library staff, as well as the scholarly staff. We have to figure out how to make this work together. And when we invest in things centrally, institutionally, how do we best leverage that investment in a way that everyone can benefit? One of the advantages of being at a small institution is, well, we can make this very strong case of, well, if you want to build it yourself, go for it, but this is all we got. And work with us to help make it better. And some of that has actually led our library at Brown into conversations, direct conversations with faculty about how to work together. And that's some of what we'll be talking about today. Some of the stories that we'll be sharing with you today are ways that we've actually worked with the library. Faculty in my center have worked with the library on specific projects that are goal-oriented, that are funded by NIH, that we're using as archetypes to demonstrate to the rest of the institution how we'll actually go forward. So as we sort of build through those major goals and talk through that, the interactive components, which we'll do more at the end, but this is supposed to be interactive, so please, as we're talking, feel free to chime in with questions and the like. As a professor, I do have this pretty bad habit of just picking on people at random if I don't feel like I'm getting a response. So at least stay awake, because I will pick on you. But as we get into the interactive component, we'll be looking at ways that you, at your different institutions, we want to hear from the diversity of institutions that are represented here, how you're looking at modifying or adapting your individual institutional repositories to meet your overall institutional needs, and then eventually towards actually developing use cases that actually capture the archetypes for the different types of use cases that could potentially be mapped to institution types as well. Because I think that's one of the things that we all know, but I don't think that everyone fully appreciates, is that it's not a one-size-fits-all. It's not one institutional repository that fits all. It's not one library that fits all. And different libraries have different structures, different hierarchies, and the like. And how does all this sort of go into action? So the current landscape, beautiful fields, right? Thinking about where we are now and what we want to do. And the one thing to think about is that there's a lot of great vision. The technology has come a long way, and I've been working with digital repositories for a long time. One of my earlier positions, so I'll also confess that I've spent most of my professional career actually working in a library of one type or another. One of the earlier libraries that I worked in at the MBL, Hui Library, we spent a lot of time looking at digital repositories of one type or another. And so we looked at Fedora, which eventually, DuraSpace and all these things, and evolves over time. And what that's resulted in is a beautiful mix, for lack of a better way of putting it, of different types of institutional repositories that have been designed for meeting specific goals that may be institutional, they may be cultural, they may be faculty driven. And in the last 10 or 15 years, libraries have been working really hard to say, well, we've spent a lot of time, energy, effort. We have the latest and the greatest. Why isn't anyone using it? And that's sort of where we're at right now. And so in thinking about that, we're also trying to sort of play, and so Patty Brennan is actually a good colleague and friend of many of ours, and I'm fortunate to say that she's a good friend of mine, and now it's fun to see her in this role. And this, when a new director at the NL is installed at the National Library of Medicine, it's an exciting time. And so in the 80s, when Don Lindbergh was installed, if you go back to the first papers that he was working on, it was sort of a similar kind of a thing, looking at Nina Matheson's report and looking at that as the vision of, here's where we want to take libraries. And in the 80s, there was a different sort of technology milieu compared to what we have now. And so looking at the national landscape of what we have now, technology isn't the problem now as much as it used to be. It's culture. And one thing in my last conversation with Dr. Brennan was, she doesn't respond to my emails as quick as she used to. I think she's got other things on her plate these days. But one of the things is that technology has become both a blessing and a curse, as I was talking about before. So everyone thinks that they can do it themselves. It's the cultural challenges now that we're seeing, in that people don't necessarily, particularly academics, are being told, on the one hand, we have to, NIH is telling me that when I get this grant funded, I have to make sure that it's archived in a way that it is discoverable prospectively. And just recently, a couple of weeks ago, they also said preprints count. You can cite preprints in your grants, which is awesome. It's high time for us at NIH in the Biomedicine to acknowledge preprints, and actually will help, I think, the funding challenges, because one of the things that we say sort of off the record is when we don't get our grants, it's usually because we're talking about work that we can't quite describe in the context of a grant application, and we can't point to some other document. Now we can actually point to detailed studies and acknowledge they haven't been fully vetted through peer review, but there's a study here. So we're sort of catching up in many ways to our colleagues in the physical sciences. So all of this and federal compliance and the like, sort of really makes it hard for us to say, well, where do we even begin? Because now that I can say that I, as an academic, can put things in a preprint, maybe I'll use bioRxiv. Or maybe I could potentially put them into our institutional repository. Well, which one should I do? We don't know the answer to that, because we can mint DOIs, we can do it just the same. And, this is that buy versus build question that we see perennially in healthcare. When is it good to have something locally versus using a remote service, and you just have a pointer, a DOI pointer, something that points to a DOI? We don't know the answer to a lot of these questions. So I think the current landscape is there's a lot of opportunity, but there's also a lot of challenge that sits in front of us. And this sort of hammers that point home in thinking about the long-term data retention requirements and policies of sharing. Academics, we love to share. I think oftentimes, especially in biomedicine, we get labeled as people who like to hoard and hide in the corner, and we're not going to share our stuff. And the reality is, especially when you're working in healthcare, we want to share, because ultimately the reason that all of us who work in healthcare as academics are doing it for the patients, and the reason that I hope that many of you work in medical libraries is it's for patient care. It's for enabling patient care to provide services for clinicians, to get patients to the information that they need, help navigate that space, help the researchers who are behind the scenes actually help to tie those dots together. And so as part of that, the federal government has public access requirements. Institutions, federal governments, state governments, everyone has some type of requirement for artifacts that we create through our research. And while many of us think, and I don't need to go into great detail with this audience, I'm sure, think of artifacts as being just publications. It's more than publications. So when I put my molecular biology hat on, it's my molecular sequences. I actually want to get credit for, I don't have that many, only a couple of hundred sequences that are in GenBank, but I'm very proud of those sequences that are in GenBank. They're mine. But there's no real way for me to easily say that those are mine. I can give the GenBank IDs or whatnot, but there's no sort of formal culture that we have for sort of allowing for those types of artifacts. And as you sort of broaden your horizons a little bit and think about, well, there's art artifacts, there's sculptures, there's other things that are true artifacts that come out of our research endeavors, even in the biomedical sciences. For example, with 3D printing, we now have artifacts that are generated that are actually a 3D structure. Well, how do we store those into our archives? How do we actually catalog that information? Now come shifting back to publications, because it'll take a huge culture shift before brick and mortar institutions like the ones that I've spent most of my professional career in change the value of publications as being the primary source of things that we are measured by. The yardstick by which I'm measured, the yardstick I measure my faculty, and that we sort of look at value of academics in biomedicine is by publications. And so publishers are saying, well, that's wonderful, but we also want you to start sharing things. And so the flagship journal in informatics, JAMIA, so I'm also on the board of directors for the American Medical Informatics Association, and in there we have looked at our flagship publication, JAMIA, and we're starting to think about, well, a lot of informatics work involves data. And we're going to sort of hot off the press, probably speaking a little out of turn, but I think that as journals like JAMIA and eventually JAMA, the New England Journal, others start to make data part of their publications, those data need to be put in spots and accessible in certain ways that actually allow for reproducible sharing. And it has to be, that's the key now at NIH, is it has to be done with rigor and it has to be reproducible. In my group, for example, we develop a lot of software tools, as you might imagine for an informatics group. How do we share the entire environment with another entity? And so we're exploring tools like Docker, for example, as a way for saying, well, we've developed this entire tool. We've got a Docker repository or a Docker that's set up that allows another user to take exactly the same computer, essentially, install it on their environment and actually use that as a vehicle for sharing our work. Institutions are very proud of the work that we do. Every institution that I've worked for, every institution that I know of is very proud and likes to show off the work that we do. And not just now, I hope they will show off my work years from now. And so that institutional preservation is just as important now as it was before when we were in a more paper-driven world. There are these interesting graphs that you can draw of how much academic output was paper-based versus digital-based. And we've now, paper is sort of the sliver, and digital is really this huge morass of stuff that has to be preserved in some way. And we have things like Dublin Core, something very basic. At least we can get started, but don't go deep enough. So a lot of the work that I do in biodiversity, we use Darwin Core for annotation of information, but even that is only just the surface. And so how do we have metadata standards for preserving information? And more important than preservation is being able to find it. Every library knows that we have those corners where we don't really know what's there, but wouldn't it be cool if we found that one cool book that no one's seen for a long time? I think every library has that, and we have that even more, exponentially more, when thinking about digital data. There's going to be that piece of data somewhere in some corner of some database that is incredibly valuable. And how do we make sure that we preserve information in a way that can be found at the right time? And as Christy talked about before, and I had just mentioned, is this ability of receiving credit for publication of data. Such an important thing and difficult to sort of grapple our heads around, especially for academics. It's we have open views towards this, but until the process of tenure and promotion changes, the reality is it's going to be the papers. And so the way we sort of skirt around that is we say, this paper, which is associated with this much volume of information that comes from that paper, look at how much that data has been used. Even though they're not citing the paper, they're using the data associated with that paper. And so that's something that's, I think, becoming increasingly important. And as all of us who work in the clinical and translational space, and as I was talking about before, is really thinking about why we do what we do, especially in healthcare. It's for the patients, and in clinical and translational science, for those who need this sort of reminder, the reason that clinical and translational science has taken flight as an important goal for us as a nation is to speed up but maintain the quality from which we go from discovery to implementation. The fact that it takes 17 years from innovation to deployment of whether it be a drug, whether it be a clinical intervention, whether it be a workflow, whether it be some discovery, is just not acceptable in the challenges that we see in healthcare. And through libraries, I wholeheartedly believe, again from a biased view, that the libraries, going back to the original roots of what libraries are for, they're gatherers. They bring people together. They're community. They're the community. The front door of all the work that we do as academics is shared through the library that brings these communities together. And clinical and translational science is built around communities. That's why we look at places like the Galter as inspiration for absolutely acknowledging that libraries aren't just there as a side service, it's there at the core. It's there as part of the clinical and translational science continuum to navigate the entire process. And so as the interest continues to grow and as we look at healthcare and impacting health and healthcare in a meaningful way, institutional repositories, we feel, and we hope we will convince you by the end of this workshop, of this session, that's where we see institutional repositories as going. So I'll hand it over to Andrew. Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for attending today's session on data repositories. I'm just going to take us through some background for what's happening at Brown as a sort of a universal example of the pressures that Dr. Sarkar has described and how we're responding to those pressures. Regardless, and today's not necessarily about a specific type of repository because regardless if you have a homegrown system or use a commercial system, these are pressures that are constant and we are all responding to them. Just at Brown, I'm using a metaphor of an ostrich here in that we didn't have a designated scholarly communications librarian or a designated scholarly communications initiative. So my colleague Hope Lappen and I had co-founded a scholarly communications working group. We call it USER, or University Scholarship Retention. And it's in repositories, and hoping our repository manager and our repository programmer, it was a part of that mission was to advise on how we could respond to these issues. Because I think that it might be a misconception to think that these are all technical solutions. When Hope arrived at the library, she sort of reminded me that a lot of the issues we're dealing with are actually people issues, and they're about workflows, and it's about communicating. So I don't want you to think that we're going to get lost in the weeds about some technical details, when I feel like what we're talking about and responding to you today, and hope that you also engage us, is how we can respond and communicate what's happening. Just for some background at Brown, here is sort of a quick timeline of digital scholarship, and you can see that a lot of digital scholarship at Brown has been centered on the humanities. Our Center for Digital Initiatives dates back to 2006. In many cases if you think 2002 with the birth of Fedora and DSpace, our special collections of materials went online, and they didn't necessarily hire an e-science librarian, which MAEd was called at the time to around 2011. So a lot of our systems had evolved with very little input from science research faculty or science liaisons. And so I think the point I'm trying to make here is that we already sort of had established systems that we had to pivot or adapt to now trying to respond to all the things that Dr. Sarkar has described. So that's why our title slide has alchemy in it, because in many cases we have a lot of work in front of us trying to evolve a system that was meant for special collections and a lot of textual, image-based dissemination to disseminating data and faculty publications. And in particular, we have not had a concerted effort at Brown to collect faculty publications before. We have no open access policy, for example. And so all of these factors combined presented a lot of barriers for us. And again, if you are wondering about our repository, these are some technical details under the hood. But again, I think these are universal principles that we're talking about. But we do have a Fedora-based repository. As you can see here, we have a lot of APIs focused on getting our special collections and image archives disseminated out to the world. We have a great repository team, including Joseph Rhodes, our repository manager, and Ann Caldwell, our metadata librarian, who started off again working with metadata for special collections and digitizing things, and she stepped up to be a great metadata librarian for the sciences. And Ben Kale, who's our programmer, I can't find a picture of him, but he exists, so I wanted to credit him as well. And these are just some information about our repository. We do have a DOI service, as Dr. Sarkar mentioned. We are slowly growing. We have about 26 terabytes of data from last year. And this is the interface for our repository. If you do go to library.repository.edu, you can see that we highlight some of our special collections up here. We refer to our repository as a suite of services. I think that's instead of as a tool. And so we hope that people can approach us for different ways that the repository might be able to support the work that they want to do. One of the things that when I stepped into this role 3 years ago was trying to look for ways that we can leverage the strengths of the repository, because I'm not here to just criticize our existing systems, but one of them is because we were so well set up for images, medical imaging fit quite well into what the repository can do. And so working with Rhode Island Hospital, Derek Merck, we've been able to ingest unique collections of medical imaging, not necessarily human. So I think one is a camel brain project, which is quite interesting. And I can't remember what the other organism was that we have. Oh, it's an ibis. That's what it was, a mummified ibis. And now they're working on a human project right now. And so we're excited to work with them on that. And so just to show you what we were up against 3 years ago, this is what our record view or item view looked like for our one of our first data sets that we ingested in the repository in 2014. And what you can see here is that the content viewer, which is traditionally set up to portray an image, right, was kind of befuddled when you ingested something that's not an image, right? So you see sort of a formatted MODS record or some metadata, and you could see our item view information captured some details that would be probably more useful for a special collection image or a text. And so this is where our starting point was. And we knew that we wanted to start capturing some of the information that would be important to researchers for citation purposes like DOIs. We knew we'd need to start capturing information about sponsored research, so the name of a funder or the grant ID. And so we sort of looked at all the issues that this item and content view had. I've mentioned some of them already. We had icons for scientific common data types like MATLAB, for example, that it was befuddled by. If you had a data set that had a relationship with another item, like documentation or metadata, it wouldn't display that relationship. If you had a multiple version of a data set, it wouldn't display those relationships. So this is where our starting point was. And I'm sure that many of you have found yourself at this point at some point or some time, or you will soon, or you're dealing with these issues as we try to evolve these systems to now deal with these types of pressures. So this is my metaphor for that transition, is that it can be kind of slow going, it can be kind of messy, but as Hope said, it's really a communication issue. And where I thought when I came in 2014, I could send Joseph a Excel spreadsheet of all of the issues. This is what's wrong. Here's the list, right? And magically think that they would all be fixed. And it's not happening like that. It's, we have this context. Everything that Dr. Sarkar just explained, we're out there on the front line speaking with researchers, hearing their feedback, but then they kind of end at that spreadsheet or that list if we don't then work with our repositories to then help bring that context back to these systems. So this is something that I'm definitely working on with Hope, is trying to sit down with our repository team and channel the faculty and the researchers' perspective into, if we're asking for changes, why are we asking for those changes? So this is an updated item view of a spreadsheet that's adjusted. And the first one I showed you in 2014, we adjusted a spreadsheet. That's what happened. We went back to our repository folks and we ingested a spreadsheet, and this is what happened. Well, we said the content viewer is befuddling people. So they said, well, let's turn it off. If you ingest a spreadsheet, it'll disappear. Well, this is what happens when it disappears. You have a very large empty void. You might not be able to figure out where to download the file, because traditionally the content viewer had been the place where someone would also download the object that they're looking for. However, you also might see on the left side that all that metadata that was pushed is kind of in a column where the content viewer once was. As I said before, it's a process. We ask for changes, we need to ask why are we asking for those changes? So what we found was, there are ways around that. So the content viewer, again, leveraging its strengths, it can look inside archive files, so things like zips. It can give you a manifest of all the contents. So if you download, for example, now a zip file containing multiple research data files, we have the content viewer now comes in very handy. You can see all the contents of the zip. There's this place to download that they've made available. Now you can see where to download the files. DOIs are now exposed. So we've made huge strides, and I'm very proud of the repository team for being able to take in our suggestions and ways of evolving these systems. This is the bottom of that same record, so now you can see information about the funder, the grant ID, a license, obviously important. I noticed in Dr. Holmes' screenshot of her repository where they had the MIT license for that stat page. You can see multiple places to download a file. We now show relationships, so this is documentation that accompanies that data set, which is handy. But there's still some vestigial pieces left over from our special collections and humanities days about, is it important for them to see the METs and MODs? Is it important for them to have those archive views? So we're working through the process of having some things disabled depending on the content type. So it's a process. And here, as I mentioned before, that the icons, for example, still need to be updated. So here, MATLAB, one of our most popular file types in the sciences, you get this sort of question mark, what is this? Or the type says undetermined, things like this. Some of our other issues have to do with actually getting data into the repository. So in 2014, all uploads were mediated. Again, Dr. Sarkar says we're a small institution, but that meant every time somebody wanted to put something into the repository, they had to contact me. And we thought, well, we have to improve that process. However, our ingest tool, again, was still sort of geared towards, not geared necessarily towards the type of information that a researcher might want to put in about that information. So we're trying to update those tools so that they fix some of these issues up here that's related to data. So for example, we had a planetary sciences researcher who kind of gave up once because if you upload one, you can only upload one file at a time unless you put things in a zip file, which isn't clear on the upload tool. And if you upload multiple files, drag and drop like he did, what it does is it creates a separate record for each of those data sets. And he got very frustrated with this, and he called me up to explain how frustrated he was with this. And all we could say is, yes, we realize this is a challenge, and we hear you, and we want to make this better for you. Please give us time, and we will work on that. And so these are some of the challenges that you might be working with as well, is about access. If someone puts something into the repository and somebody wants to edit something, putting the keys in the hand or tools in the hand of our users. We also had really no upload policy in terms of storage space or allotment of space. So our former AUL for digital technologies had told me that there was a reason originally why they didn't give them a cap, is because we were afraid that with technology improving or the cost of storage going down, that we actually could accommodate their needs if they internalized a number. So that's actually, I've just been told that because storage is not an issue, that we can actually try to encourage actually more quote unquote big data from some of our research teams, but we're still trying to figure out how to do that when we have some of these other issues to fix here. You also have to leave that ingest tool system to request a DOI. You can't do it in the same space. So after a researcher has finished entering the metadata about his or her object, then they'd have to upload and then go back to the suite of services and request the DOI. And then many times for the DOI, they're putting in most of the information that they just finished putting in from the data set. So regardless of these challenges, in 2015, we opened up for business. We put out our shingle and said, we are a data repository in addition to all of these other objects that we ingest. And we said, we will change the tire while the car is moving. And so far, our mission has been tried to address, hopefully you're familiar with the slide that the librarian Chris Erdman, who used to be at the astrophysics librarian, did with Alyssa Goodman, one of the astrophysics researchers, and Murthy, looking at, within that one particular discipline, people who put data on their own websites after so many period of years that you can't find that data anymore, the link rot. And obviously this is now being duplicated and replicated in other disciplines, and we know that this is a problem. So that was our carrot going out to faculty and saying, if you have data sets that you want to cite in your publication, don't put them on your personal web server, deposit them in our repository instead for long-term preservation purposes. And since April of 2015, we've had over 30 faculty who have taken us up on this offer, and so our data repository, data for publications, pretty much each of those records contains files that are cited in a publication. And this is where our attention is focused in terms of our data repository with grant-funded, sponsored research and publications. You can see here an example of this. Dr. Truccolo last month published in Computational Biology, and at the bottom, PLOS has a data availability statement. So they say all relevant files are available from the Brown Digital Repository with the DOI. And this is what we're trying to build on. Interestingly enough, when I came in 2014, I kept thinking that my biggest customer would be researchers with the grants. They're depositing data to comply with their data management plans. But in reality, the publication barrier has now surpassed the number of faculty coming to us to use the repositories, because they go to submit a manuscript, they get the content management system says, where's your DOI for your data set? Or they're submitting a data set and they need to, or a manuscript, and the peer review process, they need to supply data. So this has been a great boon to us. It's nice I can say something kind about our publisher community, so this has been good. And as well as grant-funded projects, so we do provide the repository space. So Dr. Chen, who collaborates with Dr. Sarkar and the Center for Biomedical Informatics, this is one of her projects. This is one that Dr. Brennan had cited in her inaugural speech, so I'm happy to have it on a slide today. And this is an example where it's a multi-collaborator project where we're collecting the publications as well as the data products from this award and trying to make all of these relatable in some way. And all those persistent identifiers that we mentioned before, this will probably be our testing ground for that. We're nowhere near the level of that credit model that Dr. Holmes has laid out, but this is where we want that to be concentrated. We have a space now where we're capturing these objects, and now we can perform analyses on what's happening in terms of the number of authors of papers. Are they increasing? Are the ranks of authors changing? Things like this that we'd love to be able to do more bibliometrics on. The other growth area, which I was totally unprepared for, was the number of people who now want to deposit data along with the dissertation or thesis. So there are some departments who are actually moving away from the idea of having a PDF altogether, and it's not necessarily in the sciences, so I help people like this in music who have performance pieces, like this is computer music, and so they have software that they develop for their performances as well as video of their performances. And our undergraduate theses, so for example, this was a senior thesis in which he had worked in one of our faculty's lab, and he has a data set from the instrument that he collected that he based his thesis on, as well as images of the experimental setup. So we, as I said, even though we have a long road ahead, we are changing the tire as the car is moving, and we need to do this to respond to all of our communities and their needs. And so these are our goals. Obviously have a less mediated process for sustainability reasons, making sure that we provide all of the persistent identifiers that I mentioned before, things like organization identifiers, ISNIs, ORCID identifiers, as that's uptaken at Brown. We don't currently provide any metrics or analytics for data in our repository, and we need to be doing that because we hear from our researchers that's what they want. And as Dr. Holmes pointed out, that's a huge opportunity for us that we're losing if we don't do that. We need to do a better job of linking between publications and these data products and other places on the web. If somebody has something in GitHub, for example, and showing those existing relationships, RDF relationships, making self-upload easier, and ultimately putting more tools in our hands and the researchers' hands, and also breaking down our silos. So for example, our data repository doesn't necessarily integrate with our Vivo instance. So somebody, if they have a publication at Vivo and they want to cite or link to a data set in the repository. And this is where we're at, I guess. And I think some of our smaller institutions, you know, last year our data repository speaker was Lisa Johnson at the University of Minnesota. They have the data repository at the University of Minnesota. University of Michigan has Deep Blue Data. You know, Dataverse folks. So there are some schools out there that have said, you know what, instead of changing the tire, let's just get an entirely separate system for publications, a separate system for data, a separate system for archives and special collections. And we don't know if we're at the point where we want to blow everything up and start over again, or if we just continue to adapt and work with the system that we have and the expertise that we have. And this is where Joseph, our repository manager, is working very hard, again, to hear input from all these communities. And so that's my Scotty metaphor here, is that, you know, we're all patient. We're still talking with researchers. We're still listening to researchers. And we hope today that the next part of this talk is, now that we've been listening, how do we translate what we've been hearing into action? And so that's why I'm going to introduce my colleague, Hope.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Okay, good, this is working. I'm just going to mention ahead of time that I'm legally blind. We actually currently have 3 screens up here, and now I have added a 4th one for me. But bear with me if anyone, if I ask a question and then I realize suddenly that I can't see how many hands people have raised, I will talk to Andrew about that, I guess. This picture of the Mars rover is mostly here because I wanted to one-up Andrew's picture of the Jeep earlier. But I am going to briefly talk about publications. Really with publications, this is a very new initiative. Andrew's been focusing on data for a long time, and we really haven't focused on publications. But a lot of the issues with the publications are similar to the issues with data that Andrew's already shown you. So going to the next slide, we have, these are just some of the sort of small technical issues. They're not small, they're huge. But these are the technical issues we're already aware of, things that we know we want. And these also are, again, similar to some of the changes that we want to make for data. What I'm actually more interested in terms of thinking about publications is thinking about things in a little bit more of a global sense and a wider sense, which is often tends to be my role on our scholarly communications group, trying to push everybody back and think, well, what do we really, really want to do? And one of the things that I like to think about is the incentives for researchers to actually use this system. And for data, that's actually a little bit simpler because of all of the incentives for the requirements that people have for journals, being able to cite their data sets there, or that they need to share their data and they need to say that they're going to share it somewhere. And this is a really good opportunity for them to do that, putting it in our BDR. But with publications, I work a lot with researchers on NIH and NSF compliance with these mandates to share and make their work publicly accessible. And what I'm very aware of is the issue of administrative burden and how often they are asked for exactly the same information for multiple systems, many of which are all in the same institution, but they don't talk to each other. And then from all these funding agencies. So I don't feel comfortable asking someone to upload a publication to our BDR when I know that they've already had to do that for the NIH, and they are overwhelmed with this type of work. So what we're trying to think about are ways that we can use the BDR to help that work. And so I know that there are some institutions that have used their repository as a place for as an excuse to get, they've tried to kind of say, well, we'll help you put things into the NIH manuscript submission system, do that deposit for you, if you give us your publication, and then we will just also happen to put it into our repository as well at the same time. And that's a nice way to get those publications. One thing that's come up recently is with the NSF public access policy, the only people who are allowed to deposit for that policy are the PIs or the co-PIs on the grant, which means that you can't ask an author who maybe is at another institution altogether to do that for you if something needs to be in compliance. And this is a big issue for some of these more diffuse grants, particularly training grants, where there may be many, many, many publications that the PIs did not author and may not even know about unless that they were cited and somehow the information got to them because it showed up in PubMed. So what we're trying to do is think about the publications not in terms of showing them for a particular researcher or even for a particular department, but to really focus on that the level of the grant, the level of the project, and collecting all the information related to a project in a kind of digital library. And because so much of the BDR was actually already mediated in the past, one nice thing about this is that we have the infrastructure to allow people to have a centralized place to deposit, and then hold it there, curate it, and maybe submit it to the NSF or the NIH when the time is right, and to submit it to the Brown Digital Repository when the time is right. And so we're kind of hoping to, once we've kind of figured out some of these workflows, then we can start talking about what changes we might need to make to the technology. But it is really about trying to rethink the way we might use this system and who's going to have access to it in the future. So now I want to kind of go back a bit in time to before I became a librarian. So I've been working in libraries for about 6 years, but before this, I worked in software quality assurance, and we developed software. And the one thing that I noticed since I became a librarian was that the business model, because I talk in all these words like business model and clients and things like that. The business model in libraries is much more complicated than I was used to. And our stakeholders that you think of are much more complicated. They're all the way from somebody whose research is employing lots and lots of people to somebody who they have to write a paper and they are coming to you at the last minute and they're just looking for some help. So you have to deal with all of this. And so within my previous work, we had this kind of organizational structure when we were building these types of projects, where we had business analysts who were out there. Their job was to understand the clients, to understand what their needs were, to understand their business environment, their environment that they were trying to work in. And then we had, they would take that information, they would communicate it to our developers. And the developers would build software based on those user requirements and explicitly on what they needed and what world they lived in. And then eventually the information would be sent to me and I would create all these tests and test it. And when I started working in libraries, I worked at the University of Pennsylvania, and I worked on the implementation of Vivo there. And it was immediately apparent to me that the natural business analysts were the liaison librarians in libraries. And in fact, anyone who's working in public services, because especially with liaison librarians, their job is to understand the discipline. Their job is to understand their users' needs, the environment that they're working in. And just as Andrew's been talking about, that we really have this understanding that maybe our development team doesn't really have. For example, there was with that very, very long abstract that showed up on one of those slides and kind of made the record very, very long, it was suggested to us that, well, we could just ask for a shorter one, which, an abstract is as long as an abstract is. And there's nothing we can do about that. And, we really needed to try to come up with a way to formalize this process. And that's what we've been trying to do through this user group that we have. Because, it is oftentimes when, in libraries, this type of expertise isn't utilized by the technology teams. I mean, sometimes it is. I've seen that. I've worked in a couple of places. And I've seen it work really well, and I've seen it not work at all. And I've also, found that a lot of times when they do seek out that expertise, they do it too late. They do it at the end. They'll ask you to test it or approve it. And they've already made really, really important decisions that make it impossible for you to make the kinds of changes that you need. So in our attempt to formalize this process, we are utilizing use cases. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about use cases, but I am first going to ask, and Andrew's going to have to tell me whether you're raising your hands or not, how many people have actually used use cases in their work?
3 hands.
Okay, so not a lot. I use them. I did not create them when I used to do this, but I absolutely depended on them for my work. And in fact, when I started working in libraries and people would ask me to look at things and evaluate them for them, I was like, great, where's the use case? Because I didn't understand how you could do that without it. So I think they are really, really essential, and I think of them mostly as a communications tool. If you went online and you looked up use cases, examples, you're going to see all sorts of different things. There's lots of different ways to do this, and you can kind of find the way that's going to be most useful for you. But basically, it's an interaction between the user and the system that documents some requirement of the system. And really, it's just basically at its heart, it's just a story about a guy who wants to deposit his data. So the things that this can do is it can help you define your requirements in a way that isn't telling the developers exactly how you want it to be done. Because oftentimes your developers, because they know more than you in some ways, in many, many ways, may have a much, much better way of doing it than you think should be the way it should be done. And this is just more of a way of starting a conversation about that rather than dictating what needs to happen. It can help you to define the scope. A lot of times people will develop use cases that are explicitly out of scope to say, these are things we're not going to do. And that clarifies things for people. In other ways, though, you can just create a bunch of use cases and then go through them and prioritize them and decide, okay, well, this is not in scope anymore, or we are going to maybe do this in the next iteration of the system, but we're going to ignore it for now. And it can also help with just essentially making decisions that are based on real-life scenarios as opposed to hypotheticals, or relying entirely on, okay, well, this other school did this, so obviously it's the right thing to do, even though it maybe isn't the best thing or the most important thing for your institution. You don't want to use use cases in a vacuum. They kind of fit in with between the sort of business level of things, and I won't say business anymore. This is sort of the strategic vision. What is the goal of your repository? And ours, it might be something like we want to collect and preserve the scholarship of the university. It may be that you want to support the needs of researchers who have to, abide by these mandates. But you have that vision, you have that goal, and it's a beautiful thing. But then on the other hand, you have like the technical realities that we all live in. Maybe you already have a system and you've just decided we're going to go with this, we're going to build on this, and we have to deal with that. And you have everybody has limited resources. So the use cases are a nice way to negotiate between the big grand vision and goals and the actual realities of what can we actually do with this system. This is an example of a use case. Andrew mentioned this a little bit earlier. This is the story of Dr. Cooper, who wants to, yeah, I did get that name right. Dr. Cooper, who wants to deposit his data. And it's just really the story of him wanting to put his data in there, and it describes 3 pieces of functionality that don't currently exist in our repository. And those I highlighted here. And you can build these in a lot of different ways. This could be just a set of bullet points. This could be split into 3 different use cases to describe each piece of functionality separately. Or, it could be something where it's a lot more detailed and it goes into explicit steps that Dr. Cooper has to go through to actually accomplish this task. You might even attach a data set to it. That might be something you might do later on. That's something I would do if I was going to be testing the system. But for our purposes in just communicating with our developers, this is sort of the format that we've decided to use. And here are some examples of the requirements as they're pulled out. And as you can see, they from the whole use case, you can see the motivation of Dr. Cooper. You can see the situation that he's in and what he needs to be able to do with his having to be able to cite this in his publication before he can submit it. And with the requirements pulled out, it's general enough for somebody to be able to say, okay, well, I can see a couple of different ways for us to do this. Let's start talking about how that might look. In terms of generating use cases, the way that we're doing it, hold on 1 second. Sorry, I moved this thing around. Okay. In terms of generating use cases, primarily what we're doing is we're using Andrew's brain because he has been doing this for quite a long time. He has 1,000 stories, and he knows what issues that people have run into, and he has, and that experience, just like with any liaison librarian, can really help you to start just kind of creating these off the bat without having to do a lot of work. But not everybody has all that experience, especially if, let's say you decided this is going to be a new project you're going to start working on. So one other ways to do it is to kind of develop a list of stakeholders that you might have. For example, you may have, say, postdocs, or you may have the department heads, or you may have grant administrators, who are people we're really thinking a lot about, actually. And then start trying to think about the ways that this tool could potentially be a wonderful thing for them and make their lives easier, and what they would potentially like to do with it, and start brainstorming about that to develop these. But sometimes you don't even really have that type of information. So it's also possible to actually do something more targeted, to go out, do interviews, or have workshops where you have people kind of talk to each other and generate these use cases. And I put in this last bit because this is sort of, I love usability testing. I think it's really important, and I think everybody should be doing it. So if you have infinite time and resources to do this, you could even, and also a prototype or a system already in place, you could actually sit down with people, in front of the system, ask them to work on, complete a task, and talk to them about it as they do it. Like, what would be better? What would you like to be able to do? What doesn't make sense or does make sense? And kind of use that usability testing framework to develop these use cases for new developments. So that is primarily what I have for our kind of plans in terms of going into this to better communicate with our developers, because they have, just like Andrew said, with sending them this big list of like, change this, change that, they don't have any context for it, and it's hard to really kind of set a priorities in terms of the way that they structure their work, which is in these sprints. So it's really better to be able to have a conversation and let them be more part of that decision making. That said, I've said before, I have not created these before, so we're kind of new to this. I think that they're really important as a communication tool, but what I was hoping was at the end we would be able to actually try to create some use cases, but I don't think we're going to have time for that. So what I'm thinking is we may end up moving, well, I guess we actually don't have any time for questions, or much time for questions either. So why don't we get into questions? Or if anyone wants to just talk about kind of their experience with using these, whether they found it positive or negative.
Hi, Patty Condon from the University of New Hampshire. So how I use cases, I'll just try to start the conversation. I've been using them to better communicate with the research computing office and IT. So we use them as a way to really in plain language just describe what people's needs are, and they've been really helpful for that, because I think that we're learning how to work together, just like I think everyone is learning how to work with their the different campus partners, but this has been a really good way to sort of get everyone on the same page as far as needs of a system, which can be very challenging, because I think some of us see similar needs, but we also see the needs from very different perspectives. So.
Started to worry that because I am talking to stakeholders who are excited about sharing feedback, that I might be developing use cases that are sort of overfitted to this one particular person who has a really particular workflow that, in my judgment as a liaison or as a business analyst, so to speak, is not widespread. Do you worry about that overfitting, and how do you solve that problem?
Well, I think that actually is definitely a problem, and may even potentially be a problem with Andrew's use case that we had as an example, because it was actually a very specific person who's like, I want it to work this way, because he was used to, what was it, Dataverse? Yeah. So I think that what you want to do is you want to generate a lot of them. Sometimes, if you see that there are multiple cases that are coming up where you have multiple people asking for, say, DOI, being able to generate a DOI with the same metadata that they use to upload. That may be something that you see multiple times with multiple types of materials. And then okay, well, if a certain requirement is in multiple use cases, it's a way of communicating that is very important. It's also important to think about these not quite as like a scientific tool for systematically determining what the needs are. You're interpreting it and deciding what's an important story. So if you have the feeling that this is a little bit too specific, it may be something where you want to say, this is a use case that exists. This is but identify that as maybe a less important one, or like lower priority, or that or end up not using that in your like formal use cases, because it's not an unbiased process at all. It is about using them to tell the story that you want, the developers to hear.
And we are guilty of over-customization requests sometime. I'll mention that the examples I had with the medical imaging, because we had 3 requests for DICOM images, I was very excited and said, well, we need an integrated DICOM viewer in the BDR. I think our repository manager had to pull me back a bit and say, well, that's, going to take a time away from these other things, and it might not necessarily help across. And I think that's the value of having Professor Sarkar and other researchers who are able to identify what are what our library AUL says for the common good. What are the elements that would be applicable in all settings? And I think even with the Dr. Cooper example, I think everyone can benefit from improving the self-upload tool. And why we're not trying to separate data and publications at this point is because there's a lot of information that benefits both of these digital products: funder information, grant IDs, licensing information. Taya?
I think that'll be our last question. Thank you. Hi, I'm Taya Atwood from University of Massachusetts Amherst. And I'm curious about your thoughts on folks who want to deposit their data in multiple repositories. So for example, we had a graduate student who wanted to deposit their data in our repository, but they also had another repository. And we had thoughts of, well, what's the record of authority when you do that? And lots of other thoughts.
Okay, I'm just answering for myself here because our repository doesn't have a policy on that, but I'm actually in favor of lots of copies keep things safe. And I think that what we've had when this has come up, because we do have some instances where we might have something in a publisher repository, but it also exists in ours, is that we make sure that if there has been a identifier issued for that data set, we have to decide which one is the data of record. So for example, there's a specific repository, a publisher repository that we felt would be a safe space. That's the one that's cited within the article. So our record, even though it contains the same data, it uses that same identifier in case someone's tracking the citations of that, and we make sure that we reference in the metadata and the mods the publication in which this appears. And so people know that there's a note that says this repository. We have other digital products that might be at NCBI, for example, that we put the accession number into, things like that. So I'm not opposed to multiple spaces.